It was just a family portrait, until you saw how the mother held the baby. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 15 years as a curator at the Charleston Historical Society, yet nothing had prepared her for what she was about to discover on that humid September morning. The museum had recently acquired a collection of post-Civil War photographs from an estate sale, and Sarah's job was to catalog and authenticate each image. Most were standard portraits of the era, stiff poses, formal expressions, families frozen in time by the slow exposure of early cameras. But one photograph stopped her cold. The image showed a black family of 5, clearly taken around 1870 based on the clothing and photographic technique. A father stood tall in a dark suit, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. 3 children surrounded them, 2 boys flanking their parents, and in the center, cradled in the mother's arms, an infant wrapped in white linen. The family's expressions were dignified, their eyes gazing directly into the camera with a quiet strength that seemed to transcend the sepia tones. Sarah had seen hundreds of similar photographs. What made this one different was something she couldn't quite articulate at first, just a nagging feeling that pulled her attention back to the image again and again throughout the morning. During her lunch break, she returned to her desk and pulled out a magnifying glass, examining the photograph more closely. That's when she saw it. The mother's hands, positioned carefully around the baby, weren't simply supporting the child. Her fingers were arranged in a specific, deliberate pattern. Thumb and first 2 fingers of her right hand extended, while the remaining fingers were folded. Her left hand mirrored the position, but reversed. Sarah's breath caught. She had seen this configuration before, years ago, in her graduate research on the Underground Railroad. Her hands trembling slightly, Sarah pulled a reference book from her shelf and flipped through pages of documented hand signals and coded gestures used by conductors and freedom seekers. There, on page 247, was an illustration that matched the mother's hand position exactly. According to the text, this particular gesture meant safe passage or protection, a signal used to indicate secure routes and safe houses along the network of escape paths that had helped thousands flee slavery. But why would this woman, photographed 5 years after emancipation, be displaying such a signal in a formal family portrait? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a family photograph anymore. This was a message, deliberately preserved across time, waiting for someone to decode it. Sarah spent the rest of that afternoon trying to learn everything she could about the photograph's origins. The estate sale records indicated it had come from the belongings of a woman named Dorothy Harrison, who had passed away at age 93. Dorothy's granddaughter, who had organized the sale, mentioned in her consignment notes that her grandmother had been an avid collector of local history, particularly items related to Charleston's black community during Reconstruction. The following morning, Sarah drove to the address listed for Dorothy's former residence, a modest house in the historic district, now occupied by Dorothy's granddaughter, Patricia. A woman in her early 50s answered the door, her face lighting up when Sarah explained her interest in the photograph. "I'm so glad someone from the museum is looking into grandmother's collection," Patricia said, welcoming Sarah inside. She always said those items held important stories that needed to be told. "Come in, please. I kept some of her research materials. I couldn't bear to throw them away, even though I didn't understand most of it." Patricia led Sarah to a converted sunroom filled with boxes of documents, letters, and journals. "Grandmother spent her last 20 years researching her own family history," Patricia explained, gesturing to the overwhelming collection. "She was convinced our ancestors played some significant role during the Civil War era, but she could never quite piece it all together. Her eyesight started failing, and she couldn't finish the work." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Do you know anything about the family in the photograph? The one with the mother holding the baby?" Patricia nodded slowly. "That's why I included it in the estate sale items for the museum. Grandmother had written something on the back. Let me find it." She rummaged through a folder and pulled out a photocopy. "Here," she wrote, "Charlotte and Thomas, 1870. The key is in how she holds the child. Ask about the river routes." Sarah stared at the notation. River routes. The phrase echoed in her mind, connecting to everything she knew about escape networks. The rivers of South Carolina, the Ashley, the Cooper, the Santee, had all served as corridors for freedom seekers, their waters carrying boats northward under cover of darkness. "Patricia, would you mind if I spent some time going through your grandmother's research? I believe this photograph may be more significant than we realized." "Please, take whatever time you need," Patricia replied. "If you can finish what grandmother started, I'd be honored." Over the next week, Sarah immersed herself in Dorothy's meticulously organized research. The elderly woman had been systematic in her approach, creating folders for different family branches and time periods. Sarah found the folder labeled Charlotte, 1840s, 1880s, and carefully spread its contents across Patricia's dining room table. Inside were birth records, property deeds, church registers, and dozens of handwritten notes. Charlotte's full name, Sarah discovered, was Charlotte Freeman, a name she had chosen for herself after emancipation. Before 1865, she had been known simply as Charlotte, property of the Westbrook Plantation, located 15 miles north of Charleston. But it was a fragile newspaper clipping from 1871 that made Sarah's hands shake as she read it. The Charleston Daily Courier had published a small article titled, "Colored School Opens on Meeting Street." The brief piece mentioned that Mrs. Charlotte Freeman, a respectable woman of good character, had opened a school for Negro children in her home, offering instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The article noted that Mrs. Freeman had acquired her own education through extraordinary means during the late conflict. Extraordinary means. Sarah sat back, her mind working through the implications. How had an enslaved woman learned to read and write when such education was not only forbidden, but criminally punishable in the antebellum South? She found part of the answer in a letter tucked between the pages of Dorothy's notebook. Written in careful, flowing script, it was dated 1868 and addressed to "My dearest sister Margaret." The letter was signed by Charlotte. "The years of darkness are behind us now," Charlotte had written. "I can finally tell our story without fear. You remember how Mother taught us letters by drawing in the ash of the fireplace, how we practiced words by tracing them in the dirt of the garden. You remember the songs that weren't really songs but maps. You remember the nights I went to the river while everyone slept, guiding souls to freedom while risking my own." Sarah's breath caught. Here it was. Confirmation that Charlotte had been involved in the Underground Railroad. But the letter continued, revealing even more. "Thomas and I are well, our boys are strong and healthy, and our daughter, born last spring, carries a mark that I believe is Providence itself. When you see her, sister, look at her back. The birthmark there resembles the shape of our beloved Santee River, the very path I traveled so many times in the darkness. It is as if God has written our story on her skin, a reminder that we must never forget where we came from or how we survived." Sarah immediately contacted Patricia with her findings. "I need to know if Dorothy ever mentioned anything about a birthmark, specifically on a female ancestor born around 1869 or 1870. Patricia was silent for a moment before responding, her voice filled with wonder. "My God, yes. Grandmother had a birthmark on her back. She used to joke that it looked like a river. She said her own mother had the same mark, and her grandmother before that. It was like a family trait, passed down through the women." "Patricia, I think your ancestor Charlotte used that birthmark as a living map," Sarah explained, her excitement barely contained. "During slavery, maps were dangerous to possess. They were evidence of escape plans. But a birthmark? That was permanent, undetectable, and could be passed down through generations as both a memory and a guide." The implications were staggering. Charlotte hadn't just been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She had created a biological archive of the routes she had used, encoding that crucial information in a way that no slave catcher or overseer could destroy. Sarah returned to the archives with renewed purpose, this time searching for any records of river routes and Underground Railroad activity in the Charleston area during the 1850s and early 1860s. She found references to a network of safe houses along the Santee River, operated by free black families and sympathetic Quakers. Several notations mentioned an unnamed conductor who had successfully guided packages, the code word for freedom seekers, along water routes with remarkable consistency. One particularly detailed account, written by a formerly enslaved man named Joshua, who had escaped in 1862, described his journey. "A woman came for us in the darkest hour. She knew the river like it was written in her blood. She took us through channels I never knew existed, avoiding patrols like she could see in the dark. She never told us her name, but she sang as she rode, songs about following the drinking gourd and wading in the water. We made it to the safe house by dawn." Sarah cross-referenced the dates and locations. The timeline matched Charlotte's known whereabouts on the Westbrook plantation. The woman in Joshua's account had to be her. But how had Charlotte managed to leave the plantation repeatedly without being caught? How had she learned the river route so thoroughly? And most importantly, how had she encoded that knowledge into her daughter's very body? Sarah's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching photographers who worked in Charleston during the 1870s, she discovered that the studio mark on the back of the family portrait belonged to a man named Augustus Bell, a free black photographer who had opened his studio in 1869. Bell's advertisements in the Charleston Daily Republican emphasized his commitment to preserving the dignity and heritage of the colored community through the photographic arts. The Charleston Historical Society had a small collection of Bell's work, and Sarah spent an afternoon examining every photograph he had taken. She noticed something remarkable. In many of his portraits of black families, the subject's hands were positioned in unusual, deliberate ways, gestures that seemed too intentional to be random poses. Sarah contacted Dr. Marcus Thompson, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in coded communication systems among enslaved and newly freed African Americans. She sent him high-resolution scans of 12 of Bell's photographs. His response came within hours. "Sarah, you found something extraordinary. These hand positions aren't random. They're a visual language, a way of preserving underground railroad signals and African cultural gestures that might otherwise be lost. This photographer was creating a historical archive disguised as family portraits. Dr. Thompson continued, "The mother in your photograph isn't just holding her baby in the safe passage position. Look at her left thumb. It's pointing downward. Combined with the other fingers, this specific configuration means hidden waterway or secret river route. She's literally holding her child as a map, and the photographer captured it knowing exactly what it meant." Sarah felt chills run down her spine. Augustus Bell hadn't just been a photographer, he had been a documentarian of resistance, preserving the methods and symbols of freedom in plain sight, hidden within seemingly ordinary family portraits. She returned to Bell's business records and found a ledger entry from October 1870. Freeman family, full portrait sitting. Special request, ensure hand positions are clear in final print. Payment, $3 and one hand-drawn map of local waterways. A map. Charlotte had paid Bell not just with money, but with cartographic knowledge, the very routes she had memorized and used during her years as a conductor. Bell had preserved that payment among his papers, and Sarah found it in the archive. A detailed sketch of the Santee River and its tributaries, marked with symbols indicating safe houses, dangerous crossings, and patrol points. Armed with Charlotte's map and the growing body of evidence, Sarah began to reconstruct the full scope of the Underground Railroad network that had operated in and around Charleston. She reached out to other historians, genealogists, and descendants of families who might have been involved in the resistance movement. One name kept appearing in different records: Thomas Freeman, Charlotte's husband. Before the war, Thomas had been hired out by his enslaver to work as a carpenter in Charleston, which gave him unusual mobility and access to information. Sarah found work permits showing that Thomas had built furniture and performed repairs for several Quaker families and free black households, the very same addresses that appeared on Charlotte's map as safe houses. The pieces were falling into place. Thomas had used his carpentry work as cover to identify sympathetic families and establish safe houses. Charlotte had used her intimate knowledge of the plantation's geography and the river systems to guide people along escape routes. Together, they had operated a sophisticated network right under the noses of some of Charleston's most prominent slaveholding families. But the risks they had taken were almost unimaginable. Sarah found court records from 1861 documenting the trial of 3 people accused of helping enslaved persons escape. All 3 had been convicted, 2 were sold further south, and 1 was executed. The penalty for what Charlotte and Thomas had done was death, yet they had continued their work throughout the war years. Patricia invited Sarah to meet her extended family, many of whom had gathered after learning about the research. In Patricia's living room, Sarah met Dorothy's great-niece, an elderly woman named Ruth, who was 91 years old. Ruth's eyes were sharp and bright as she listened to Sarah's findings. "My grandmother, Dorothy's mother, told me stories when I was a girl," Ruth said quietly. "She said our family had a special gift, that we carried freedom in our blood. I never understood what she meant until now. She had the birthmark too, you know. She showed it to me once and traced her finger along it, saying, 'This is how they found their way home.'" Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. Home hadn't meant the plantation or even Charleston. It had meant freedom, the true home that Charlotte had helped so many people reach. The infant in the photograph, the child whose body carried the river map as a birthmark, had to be traced through generations to the present day. Sarah worked with Patricia and Ruth to construct a family tree, following the maternal line from Charlotte forward. Charlotte and Thomas's daughter had been named Grace. Birth records from 1870 confirmed her arrival in March of that year. Grace had grown up in Charleston, attending her mother's school and later becoming a teacher herself. She had married in 1889 and had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. Each of the daughters, according to family testimony, had been born with a distinctive birthmark. Sarah interviewed Grace's granddaughter, a woman named Clara, who was 86 and living in a nursing home in North Charleston. When Sarah explained the significance of the birthmark, Clara's face transformed with emotion. "I always wondered why Mama was so protective of our marks," Clara whispered. "She never let us feel ashamed of them, even when other children stared. She said they were our heritage, our proof that we came from strong women. I have 2 daughters, and they both have the mark. My granddaughter has it too." Clara carefully lifted her blouse to show Sarah her back. There, spanning from her left shoulder blade down toward her lower back, was a birthmark the color of dark caramel, and its shape unmistakably resembled the winding course of a river, with smaller tributaries branching off the main channel. Sarah photographed the birthmark with Clara's permission, then compared it to Charlotte's hand-drawn map. The correspondence was extraordinary. Every major bend in the river, every significant tributary. They were all there, encoded in pigment on Clara's skin. "This birthmark has traveled through 6 generations," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your ancestor Charlotte knew that maps could be destroyed, that documents could be burned, that memories could fade. But she found a way to preserve the routes to freedom in a form that could never be taken away. She turned her own daughter into a living archive. Clara reached out and gripped Sarah's hand. Then we have to make sure the story is told. Not just for our family, but for everyone who walked those paths. They deserve to be remembered. As Sarah delved deeper into Charleston's archives, she discovered records that shed light on the specific rescues Charlotte had conducted. Cross-referencing plantation records with accounts from formerly enslaved people who had published their narratives after the war, Sarah identified at least 17 documented cases where escapees had mentioned a female conductor operating along the Santee River between 1856 and 1863. One particularly detailed account came from a memoir published in 1879 by a man named Samuel, who had escaped from a plantation near Georgetown. He described how a woman had appeared at the edge of the rice fields one night in 1860, signaling with hand gestures that he should follow. She had led him through marshland and cypress swamps to a hidden boat. She rode for hours without speaking, Samuel wrote, but she sang old spirituals that I knew, but with different words woven in. She sang about the river turning east, about the oak tree with 3 trunks, about the house with the blue door. I realized later these were directions, landmarks. If I ever needed to make the journey again or help someone else, the songs would tell me how. Sarah recognized the locations Samuel mentioned. They all appeared on Charlotte's map. The oak tree with 3 trunks still stood near the Santee, now a protected landmark. The house with the blue door had been documented as a Quaker safe house operated by the Morrison family. But what struck Sarah most was the method of teaching. Charlotte hadn't just guided people to freedom, she had equipped them with knowledge, empowering them to potentially help others. This was education in its purest form, transmitted through song and memory in circumstances where written instruction would have been impossible and deadly. Sarah found similar patterns in other escape narratives. Multiple accounts mentioned songs that served as encoded maps, and several specifically noted a female conductor who taught through singing. Charlotte had created an oral curriculum for survival and resistance, each spiritual a lesson in geography and strategy. The scope of Charlotte's work was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than Sarah had initially imagined. This wasn't just a woman who had helped her family or a few neighbors. This was a systematic, sustained operation that had likely helped dozens, possibly hundreds, reach freedom. 3 months after Sarah's initial discovery, she had assembled a comprehensive picture of Charlotte's life and legacy. Working with Patricia, Ruth, Clara, and other family descendants, she had documented the full scope of Charlotte's Underground Railroad activities and the ingenious methods she had used to preserve that history. The photograph, Sarah now understood, was a deliberate act of defiance and preservation. In 1870, with Reconstruction underway but its future uncertain, Charlotte and Thomas had commissioned Augustus Bell to create a permanent record, one that would outlast them, one that would speak to future generations in a language that those who knew would understand. The way Charlotte held baby Grace wasn't just a signal of safe passage. It was a declaration. We survived. We resisted. We preserved the paths to freedom. And we are ensuring that this knowledge lives on. Sarah discovered that Charlotte had continued teaching until her death in 1893. The school she founded had operated for over 20 years, educating hundreds of children. Among her papers, Sarah found lesson plans that incorporated geography, map reading, and navigation skills, practical knowledge disguised as general education, but clearly intended to ensure that the next generation would never be helpless or lost. Thomas had worked alongside Charlotte throughout their lives, his carpentry skills providing legitimate income, while also allowing him to build hidden compartments, false floors, and secret passages in the homes of sympathetic families. After emancipation, he had used those same skills to construct churches and schools throughout the Charleston area, creating spaces where Black communities could gather, learn, and build their own futures. The photograph had captured them at a pivotal moment, free, together, determined to document their resistance and pass it on. Every detail of that image had meaning. Charlotte's hands encoding the river routes, Thomas's protective stance representing the safe houses he had established, the older boys standing strong representing the future generation that would carry the legacy forward, and baby Grace serving as the living map, her birthmark a permanent testament to the paths their people had walked toward freedom. Sarah prepared a comprehensive report for the Charleston Historical Society, recommending that the photograph and all associated materials be featured in a major exhibition about Underground Railroad activity in the Low Country. On a warm April morning, the Charleston Historical Society opened its new permanent exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight, Charlotte Freeman and the Living Maps of Freedom. The centerpiece was the 1870 family portrait, now understood not as a simple photograph, but as a coded historical document of resistance and survival. Sarah stood in the gallery as visitors moved through the exhibition, reading the story of Charlotte and Thomas, examining the hand-drawn maps, listening to recordings of the spirituals that had served as verbal navigation guides. Next to Charlotte's portrait hung contemporary photographs of her descendants, 6 generations of women, each bearing the distinctive birthmark that had become their family's proudest heritage. Patricia, Ruth, Clara, and over 30 other family members had gathered for the opening. Clara's granddaughter, a young woman named Maya, who was studying history at the College of Charleston, stood before the photograph of her ancestor with tears streaming down her face. "I used to hate my birthmark," Maya admitted to Sarah. "Kids in school called it ugly. I tried to hide it, but now I understand what it really is. It's not just a birthmark. It's a map, a memory, a message. It's my great-great-great-great-grandmother telling me that I come from people who were brilliant and brave, who turned their own bodies into archives because they knew their stories mattered too much to be forgotten." While Sarah watched as families, black, white, and every background, gathered around the exhibition, learning about this remarkable chapter of Charleston's history that had been hidden for so long. Children practiced the hand signals, tracing the maps, asking questions about how the Underground Railroad had worked. The photograph that had seemed so ordinary just months ago was now recognized for what it truly was: a masterwork of coded communication, an act of historical preservation, and a testament to the ingenuity and courage of people who refused to let their stories die. As the afternoon light slanted through the museum windows, Sarah noticed Clara standing alone before the portrait, her hand pressed against the glass. Sarah approached quietly. "She's still teaching us," Clara said softly, gazing at Charlotte's face. "Even now, over 150 years later, she's still showing us the way. Not just the way to physical freedom, we have that now, but the way to remember, the way to honor those who came before, the way to carry their strength forward." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The photograph would remain here, preserved and protected, continuing Charlotte's work of teaching and bearing witness. The map that Charlotte had encoded in her daughter's skin had traveled through generations, and now, finally, the whole world could see what it meant. Not just the routes along the river, but the path from bondage to freedom, from silence to voice, from erasure to permanent memory. Charlotte Freeman had found a way to write her story in ink that would never fade, in the geography of rivers, in the language of hands, in the very skin of her descendants. And now, that story would endure for generations yet to come, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who had walked the path to freedom.